The Avalon TRD may just be the ultimate oxymoron in Toyota's lineup, because when the Avalon first launched in North America, this was definitely trying to be the Japanese Buick. This was Toyota's answer to full-size sedans in America, which at that point were not exactly sporty. The front-end styling on the first few generations of Avalon may be boring, but this generation is certainly more distinctive. I am not the biggest fan of what's going on with this grille. Mainly it has to do with this little top section right here that kind of flares back out. There's a little bit of Lexus Predator going on here, but the grille is enormous and it's very, very hungry. It's also really accentuated in the TRD model that I'm driving here because we have this sort of off-white paint and then a lot of black accents. In the rest of the Avalon lineup, there's a bit more to break up the grille, and in the TRD model, there's even more black going on. For instance, we have these big black splitters on the front. We have full LED headlamps in all models, but they do change a little bit based on the trim that you're in. When you go in for a closer look, as with many new vehicles, the vast majority of this grille is not used for cooling. It really is just there for the aesthetic. You can see we have that large crash structure that runs right through the enormous grille. Aero treatments on either side of the grille are fully functional, however, and here's a closer look at the LED headlights. These are LED reflectors. The turn signal is also an LED element. In this generation, the Avalon and Camry are very closely related. You can think of the Avalon as sort of a 110% scale Camry. Things are a little bit larger, but they're not a great deal larger, especially on the inside. So although we do find a bit more room, it's not an enormous improvement. For 2020 and 2021, the Camry also gets a TRD version, but it's a little bit more extreme than the TRD Avalon, which again makes sense since the Avalon is theoretically supposed to be a little bit more grown up, a little bit more isolated. For the Avalon, Toyota lowered the ride height. You can definitely see that when you take a look at this parked right next to a regular Avalon. They've also added some extra treatments to the bottom of the vehicle. Now, I apologize that there is a bit of mud on this Avalon. It has been absolutely pouring out here all week long, and I'm filming this in a very, very brief break in the rain. It's supposed to start raining in about 45 minutes, so hopefully this video will be done by then. You can see that we also have slightly wider wheels, 235 with tires, upgraded brakes, and the suspension is stiffer than the regular Avalon. And that's my one complaint about the Avalon TRD, is that I think it ends up being just a little bit too firm. We'll talk about that later. Versus the regular Avalon, the front suspension is 10% firmer and the rear suspension is 15% firmer. Changes to the rear are a bit more subtle than we find in the Camry TRD. We find a spoiler right here on top of the trunk lid rather than a wing like we find in that Camry TRD model. We still have a red TRD badge there, a lot of black accents going on even again on this white model, and then large dual exhaust tips down at the bottom of the bumper. The exhaust system has been modified versus the regular Avalons. This is definitely louder, and for some folks they might find it a little bit drony, but this is more civilized and quieter than the one in the Camry TRD. So if you don't like the one in the Camry TRD, you think it went just a little bit too far, you might want to take a look at the Avalon. As we see in most of the Toyota lineup, there are more driver assistance features standard on the Avalon, like radar adaptive cruise control and lane keeping assistance, than we find in the vast majority of the competition. Although that does get a little bit tricky because you could compare things like the Honda Accord or the Toyota Camry to the Avalon, and they're going to have very similar systems standard. When rumors first started leaking that the Avalon and Camry were going to get a TRD variant, I have to admit I was hoping that the V6 would be combined with all-wheel drive and perhaps a bit more power. Rather unfortunately, neither of those things happened. So this is the same 3.5-liter V6 we find in the regular Avalon. It produces just over 300 horsepower and 267 pound-feet of torque. It's mated to a standard 8-speed automatic transmission, and it sends power only to the front wheels. If you want an all-wheel drive Avalon, that is available, but you have to get the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine that we find in the base model Camry. If you want to save fuel, there is the Avalon Hybrid, but it doesn't produce 301 horsepower like this V6 does, so clearly this is the performance choice. So who is the Avalon for? Well, with 300 horsepower under the hood, this is just about as powerful as most of the full-size competition. Admittedly, there aren't as many full-size competitors as there were before, with the obvious exception of course, the Chrysler 300 and the Dodge Charger. The Chrysler 300 is available with a 5.7-liter V8 engine that produces definitely more horsepower than we find out of this 3.5-liter V6, and the Charger is available with several engines that are far more powerful than what we find under this hood. Not too many Avalon shoppers are really going to be considering the American alternatives, so I think that the most direct competition to this is Toyota's own Camry, or of course something like the Nissan Maxima. I'm going to give these seats 7 out of 10 points in terms of front seat comfort. Comparisons for the Avalon are a little bit difficult, obviously more limited with the Avalon TRD that I'm driving here, but if you're generally speaking shopping for an Avalon, you probably are also cross-shopping a Lexus ES. I think those seats are a little bit more comfortable up front. You could also be comparing this to something like the Kia Cadenza also a hair more comfortable in the top-end version, or the Nissan Maxima. There's a lot to dislike about the Maxima, but the front seats are definitely very comfortable. I also find certain versions of the American competition to be a little bit more comfortable than this as well. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a moderate range of motion, and the front passenger seat does not have the same range of motion as the driver. As we see in many Toyota vehicles, the front passenger seat is missing the adjustable lumbar support, and you will find four-way lumbar in some of the competition. In the Avalon lineup, keep in mind that the Avalon TRD is one slot below the absolute top-end trim of Avalon. So there are going to be a few features that we find in that very top-end Avalon that you don't get in the TRD model. Hopping into the back seat, we find about 2 inches more combined legroom in here than we find in the Toyota Camry, but oddly enough, about the same amount of combined legroom that we find in the Honda Accord. So this is just about as spacious on the inside. Headroom is relatively generous back here. If I sit upright in this rear seat with my head on the headrest, my hair is just barely brushing the ceiling, but oddly enough, there's about 1/10 of an inch less headroom in here than we find in the Camry. All seating positions get red seat belts. That's definitely very daring for something like the Avalon. And that even includes the middle seat position. Going all the way over here to the right side, the front seat's almost all the way back in its track, suitable for a 6'5" passenger. As you can see, I still have a reasonable amount of legroom, about 4 inches left. So one of the other reasons you might want to get the Avalon over the Camry, logically, is that rear seat accommodation, child seat accommodation, anything that requires a bit more legroom. Behind the trunk lid, we find just over 16 cubic feet of storage space. This is 1 cubic foot more than we find in the Toyota Camry, but actually a little bit less than we find in the Honda Accord. The era of full-size sedans, meaning that you get an absolutely cavernous trunk, is well and truly over in the United States. 16 cubic feet is among the largest trunks out there. It's just not quite the largest available right now. Going in for a closer look, we have Avalon and TRD embroidered on this trunk floor mat. You can also see we have some red stitching there on the edge. We find a compact spare tire. Definitely enough room there, I think, for a full-size spare tire if you wanted to delete this foam divider that stores the jack and tire iron as well. In the Alex Nauto's exclusive Trunk Comfort Index, the Avalon scores 7 out of 10 points. When I think full-size sedan, I really want an enormous trunk. So the size of the Avalon's trunk is a little bit disappointing for me, but we do have a lot of nice touches. Like we have a 60/40 folding rear seat back. We don't find that in all full-size sedans for some reason. The releases are right back here in the cargo area. There is a temporary spare tire under this load floor that gains Toyota a few points, but it's not a full-size spare, so they lose a few there. We also don't really have any good way of closing this trunk lid rather than just grabbing the outside. There's no handle on the inside of the trunk lid. As we look around the interior, bear in mind that this is not the top-end trim. If you want absolutely everything in your Avalon, you're going to want the touring trim. We do, however, have a pretty standard-sized moonroof right here over the driver and front passengers' heads. Here's another look at those very red seat belts. We have the TRD logo embroidered in the front headrests, red contrasting stitching going on there as well. The upholstery has a red insert in the middle of the seat back, and as you can see, we have some faux suede inserts right there. These seats are perforated, but they're not ventilated in this particular model. We get very similar treatments to the rear seats, but with slightly different styling, and the faux suede is simply reserved for the side of the rear bolsters. Speaking of bolsters, the front seat design does not depart too much from the regular Avalon, so bolstering on the seat back and seat bottom cushion is fairly minor. Larger drivers and passengers shouldn't have any problems fitting in here, but smaller folks might slip around a bit. Moving over to the front doors, a large portion of the door is made from soft touch materials. We have a very soft touch armrest right there with some of that same red stitching that we find on the seats, but there are kind of an unusual combination of materials on this door. For instance, this band right here between the soft touch upper section of the door and this stitched middle section of the door is actually a hard plastic that is textured to match what's going on up top. We also have a trim piece right here, just right by that rear view mirror, that's different than anything else that we find in the doors, but it does match this trim piece right here on the dashboard. The dashboard itself is a soft touch injection molded component with a stitched component right here in front of the passenger. On the passenger side, we have a bin-style glove compartment. I wasn't able to fit a large tablet computer inside. And then going back up the dashboard, this is not an Audi 5000 style vent. There's just one over there on the passenger side, and then we get this chrome bar that helps tie the design together. Moving over to the middle of the dashboard, we find a touchscreen infotainment system here. This is one of the larger ones available in this segment, although we do now find a slightly larger screen available in the Kia Cadenza. We have some physical buttons on either side, which is definitely my preference. I prefer these greatly to just touch button interfaces. The rest of the software package is essentially identical to what we've seen in other Toyota models for a while. It's worth noting that smartphone integration does take a bit longer to load in this system than most of the competition. Below the screen, we find 2 large air vents right there. We also find the controls for the 2-zone automatic climate control system, heated seats up front in this particular model. Physical buttons right there for that climate control. The storage area in front of the shifter is definitely large enough to store large smartphones or some of those larger tablets. We have 2 cup holders here, kind of an unusual shape, a round one here, and this one's sort of a D shape. So if you have juice boxes or anything like that, they'll fit a little bit better in this compartment right there. Pretty typical console shifter, red stitching again. There's a sport mode with a manual mode over to the left. We do have paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel. There's a drive mode selector right behind that. We have eco, normal, and sport, auto brake hold, and then an electronic parking brake. Most of the center console is covered in soft touch materials. We have stitch sections right here around the cup holders and the center console lid, also on either side where your knees will rub, but then the faces are actually a hard plastic, similar texture to what we find going on the doors. Center console between the front seats is stitched right there. It opens to reveal a pretty decently sized storage compartment. This is where we find the USB interface. In addition to the single USB interface for the infotainment system, we have a USB-C and a regular USB charge-only port. There's also a second set of these same style ports on the back of the console for the rear seat passengers. Although the infotainment system is a little bit behind the competition, I think this is the best looking instrument cluster in this segment. It's a partial LCD unit, so we have a 7-inch LCD in the middle, and then physical gauges for the speedometer and tachometer. The central display is not only larger than most of the competition, I think the graphics are also a little bit more modern and upbeat as well. We have vehicle messages, things like the trip fuel economy, eco indicators, status of the vehicle's driving assistance systems, audio readouts. The animations in this display are relatively well done, and then this is where we would adjust the way some of the vehicle's safety systems function. The steering wheel is a round 3-spoke design that we find in a wide variety of different Toyota vehicles. On the back of the steering wheel, we have paddle shifters up on the right, down on the left. You can't really see them from this particular camera angle. On the right spoke, we have the controls for the adaptive cruise control system, track forward, backward, and a mode button. On the left side of the steering wheel, we have the other infotainment controls, and then the controls for that multifunction LCD. In my 0 to 60 testing, this model took 5.9 seconds to get up to highway speed. That's 1/10 of a second slower than the last time I drove the Avalon. The most likely reason for that is simply traction. It has been a little bit colder up here in Northern California, so those tires are going to be a little bit harder. And again, it has been raining this entire week. I did the 0 to 60 test, however, when it was dry, but the roadway was probably still a little bit moist, so traction can likely account for that extra 1/10 of a second. Just under 6 seconds is certainly a respectable 0 to 60 time and faster than some of the options in this segment, like the Kia Cadenza. It has a less powerful V6 engine under the hood, but this is not going to be as quick as basically any of the V8 competition. So if you're looking at the Avalon TRD as the corollary to something like a Dodge Charger with the 5.7 liter V8, keep in mind, this is definitely going to be slower. But it is going to have a different and a bit more sorted feel out on the road. The Charger definitely feels large and in charge out on the road, and by that I mean not quite as in charge in the corners, and the Avalon definitely cuts a neater, tidier rug. Unless you're talking about the top-end versions of the Challenger or Charger, where they actually will handle better than the Avalon. Remember that the Charger has some crazy wide tires available on it. You can get up to 305 with summer tires from the factory on that Charger, so logically, those versions of that sedan are going to out-handle what we find in the Avalon. Thanks to the lighter curb weight versus the rear-wheel drive competition, 235 with tires, and the enlarged brakes that we find in the TRD model of Avalon, it took 112 feet for this vehicle to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That is shorter than the last Avalon that I've tested, and definitely shorter than most of the direct competition, again excluding those performance-dedicated models. The trouble, of course, is that those performance options do exist, and that's part of why I'm going to give handling an A-. Now, don't get me wrong, the Avalon has a great feel to it. This latest generation of Toyota's platforms have really improved in terms of their suspension and steering dynamics. Just overall vehicle dynamics are greatly improved over previous models. So it's not that the firm suspension doesn't belong in the Avalon because of the way the rest of the vehicle is designed. It just doesn't strike me as belonging to the Avalon name, I guess you'd say. This vehicle really is absolutely not a problem. It's just not exactly what comes to mind when I think of Toyota Avalon, and perhaps that's exactly why Toyota has done what they've done. In terms of handling, I think this has a more sorted feel to it out on the road than the Nissan Maxima, definitely more than the Kia Cadenza. Also, the Chrysler 300 or the Dodge Charger, whether we're talking about the 3.6 liter V6 or the 5.7 liter V8. The tricky thing there, of course, is that the FCA alternatives are rear-wheel drive. So if you want to do burnouts and donuts, then you're going to have to get one of those models. But if you're simply talking about the way this feels out on the road, the Avalon feels lighter and more nimble out on your favorite winding mountain road. The engagement factor, I think, is a little bit better in here. The Chrysler 300 and the Dodge Charger can feel bigger and heavier depending on the roadway that you're driving on. The downside to that, in a way, is the suspension tuning. As you can see, there is definitely a firm tune to this suspension, and a lot of road imperfections out here on the paved road are certainly coming into the cabin. Out on a rougher road like the one that I'm on here, the firmer suspension is definitely noticeable. We certainly feel more of the road imperfections coming into the cabin. This is the most un-Avalon-like tuned the Avalon suspension that I think I've ever driven. If you're debating between Avalon trims, the ground clearance is an important thing to keep in mind. Remember, this is a sedan, not a crossover, so ground clearance is obviously going to be lower than a Highlander, and there are going to be parking lot situations where the TRD version of the Avalon might scrape that front lip, but the regular version of the Avalon might not. When it comes to cabin noise, I'm going to give this model a B- because it is a little bit louder than the regular Avalon. In my cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, I got 71.5 decibels in here. That makes this louder than the Cadenza, louder than the last Maxima that I tested, and louder also than something like the Charger and the Chrysler 300. I think the reason is twofold. The tires are a little bit different on this model, and the exhaust system is different. You can definitely get more of that exhaust note in the cabin. Some people may like that, some people may not. However you feel about it, however, it does make the cabin louder. And you'll especially notice that above 50 miles an hour, at say 60 or 70 miles an hour, this exhaust system can feel a little bit drony. This exhaust actually reminds me a bit of Nismo exhausts, to be honest. Now there's a good side to that and there's a bad side to that. The good side is that if you're really revving the nuts off this engine out on your favorite winding mountain road, it has a good exhaust note to it. But I wish it was quieter out on the open highway. When you're going 60 or 70 miles an hour, I just don't like the droning in the cabin. Now that said, this is less drony than the Camry. So if you're looking at the Camry TRD and you think to yourself, gosh, I wish it had just a little bit more legroom and a slightly quieter exhaust, there's an Avalon for you. The Avalon is a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier than the Camry, but the difference isn't enormous. So if you're driving these two vehicles back to back, you're going to see a few more similarities than differences. It's going to be a little bit more nuanced. The Camry is going to be a little bit firmer in the TRD trim. Neither of these vehicles has an adaptive suspension system, rather unfortunately. You'll find that only in the top-end Avalon model. I really wish the TRD had gotten that, because that would have been another differentiator between this and the Camry TRD, and I think it would have helped make this a little bit more daily driver livable. Also, a selective valved exhaust system could have been handy, so that way this could have been quieter out on the open highway and a little bit louder out on your favorite winding mountain road. The interesting thing about this exhaust system is that when you are driving it harder versus just daily driving, it doesn't seem quite as loud as sometimes that reverb in the cabin can feel. When it comes to fuel economy, clearly the Avalon Hybrid is going to be the winner in this segment. So I'm going to give this particular model a B when it comes to fuel economy. I've been averaging 23 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. If you want to get easily over 30 miles per gallon, the Avalon Hybrid is definitely going to be that vehicle. It's easily the most efficient option in this segment. It's very clear that for whatever reason with this Avalon TRD, they're trying to shed the Japanese Buick image that a lot of people bring up when they think about the Avalon. Whether or not that makes sense for the Avalon, I'll leave for all of you to decide down there in the comment section below. But as I said before, the interesting thing about the Avalon is that it's not that the firmer suspension and the exhaust note and the red bits and bobs here and there are out of place in the Avalon based on the way that it drives. This really does have a great feel to it. The suspension has a good tune, even though it is on the firmer side of things that I would like. It has a very sorted steering feel to it. The engine is definitely fun to rev up, but does that belong in a vehicle with an Avalon logo on the back? I'll let all of you decide. Let's be honest, the Avalon is one of those difficult to categorize vehicles that probably doesn't really have much natural competition. If we're talking about the bestseller in the segment, that would clearly be the Dodge Charger, and it blows all of the other options out of the water. But the Charger isn't selling well because it's the same thing as the Avalon and it just does that thing better. The Charger sells well because of the crazy engine lineup that we find in that Dodge. And that's the likely reason that the Dodge is outselling the Chrysler 300 by a million miles. Not only can you get a 5.7 liter V8 in there, you can get a 6.4 liter V8, a bunch of different tunes of the 6.2 liter supercharged engine, all the way up to nearly 800 horsepower. It's a very different kind of animal. Meanwhile, in the Avalon lineup, things start at $35,875 for the XLE trim, and you can logically think of the Avalon as an extension of the Camry lineup. It's the grown-up Camry. It's styled a little bit differently, a little bit less look at me perhaps than we find in the Toyota Camry. It's a little bit larger, it's tuned a little bit differently, but the two vehicles are very, very closely related, and they share a lot under the hood. They share the same V6 engine, the same hybrid system, and the same four-cylinder engine as well. If you want that hybrid option, that's going to start at $37,000 for the XLE trim, and things are going to top out in the limited hybrid trim at $43,300, plus, of course, any packages that you want to add to that model. If you want the sporty trim of the Avalon that I was driving this week, that TRD is going to start at $42,875. There's also an XSE trim, a nightshade trim, and a two-ring trim if you want an adaptive suspension. Personally, I love the two-ring trim the most in the Avalon lineup. There's the 3.5-liter V6, a 215 horsepower hybrid system, and the 205 horsepower naturally aspirated four-cylinder engine as well. So there's something for everyone in the Avalon lineup. But as you can see, it's very, very similar to the Camry. It's just sort of Camry Plus. As far as competition goes, the most direct competitor is probably going to be the Nissan Maxima. The Maxima, however, is considerably older than the Avalon. It's really noticeable when you take a look at the exterior and interior design that this comes from a slightly different era from Nissan. Now, they recently gave it a refresh, and they did give it a new infotainment system, and they've updated a few parts here and there, but the odd part about the Maxima is that it's not really bigger inside than the Altima. The Altima has continued to grow over time, the Maxima has not, so at this point you'll actually get more interior room inside the Altima. I'm not quite sure whether the Maxima lives up to its four-door sports car legacy, but it certainly is fun to drive on the road. It handles well, it has great acceleration from that 3.5-liter V6 and the CVT, and Nissan's V6 sounds absolutely excellent. I'm just not sure whether I would buy it over the Altima. The Altima with the 2-liter turbo has a great feel out on the road. 0 to 60 acceleration is not that far off what we see in the Maxima. We actually get a little bit more room, and the entire vehicle just feels more modern as well. The next closest competitor has to be the Kia Cadenza. But the Cadenza has a little bit of a different twist, because the Cadenza is trying to compete with both the Avalon and the Lexus ES, and that really is obvious when you take a look at the way that it's tuned. It's tuned towards the softer, more luxurious side of things, rather than trying to be a competitor to something like the TRD version of the Avalon. The Cadenza is also priced somewhere in between, starting at $37,850. It has a ton more standard equipment than we find in the Avalon, but it has a higher sticker price. Personally, I like the styling of the Cadenza inside and outside just a little bit more than we see in the Avalon, but the Avalon definitely has a lot of things going for it. We have that available hybrid system, we have all-wheel drive if that's something that you're looking for, there's a sporty version, there's a version with an adaptive suspension system, etc. Toyota has really decided that even though sales are significantly below the bestseller in this particular segment, that they're going to toss a lot of options into the Avalon and really make a play at this group. And of course, if you wanted an even more luxurious Avalon, there is the very closely related Lexus ES that is Avalon-sized, since the two vehicles are based on the same platform, and takes things up to the next level when it comes to interior refinement. But obviously, it's going to be more expensive than the Avalon. If you're looking for all-wheel drive and a V6 under the hood in your next non-luxury full-size sedan, you basically have three options: the Chrysler 300, the Dodge Charger, and the Kia K900. The least expensive of these is obviously going to be the Charger, but the Chrysler 300 is relatively inexpensive and probably a more logical competitor to the Avalon in many ways. It's going to start at $30,445. It definitely undercuts what we see in the Avalon. The interior of the Chrysler 300 is starting to feel a little bit old. We do have some nice touches in there, but as it's aged, Chrysler has started removing options from the interior in favor of putting more R&D money into the Charger, because the Charger sells significantly better. Obviously, if you're looking for a V8 engine under the hood, that's another reason that you might want to look at something like the Chrysler 300, but for some reason you can no longer get the V8 and all-wheel drive together in these vehicles. I'm not entirely clear why. Logically, they would fit under the hood. They use that same drivetrain in a wide variety of other vehicles, and at one point in time, they did have V8 all-wheel drive versions of these vehicles, just not at the moment. And lastly, we have that Kia K900. The K900 is really an odd duck here because it's trying to be a Kia BMW 5 Series, but obviously it has a Kia logo on the front, which really takes it out of the luxury car running for a wide variety of shoppers. It's going to be more expensive than the Toyota Avalon, starting at $59,900, but it does come with a twin-turbo V6 standard all-wheel drive, and it's a rear-wheel drive biased all-wheel drive system. The interior definitely looks like something that Lexus could use for their next Lexus GS. It's not quite where we see the Lexus LS in terms of interior refinement, but it is a smaller and much less expensive vehicle. It certainly punches above its weight when it comes to the interior refinement for its price tag. You can think of it as the Kia version of the previous generation Genesis G80, if you will. Why am I including the K900 here? Well, logically it has a Kia logo on the front, not a luxury brand logo. It's about the same size as the Avalon. It's not too far off. And with all the dealer discounts and extra cash on the hood, it may get down to about $10,000 more than the top-end versions of the Avalon. It's still going to be more expensive, but there really aren't very many competitors to talk about here in the full-size sedan segment. And each of these competitors are going after a slightly different customer. That's probably the best way to explain full-size sedans at the moment in the US. The Avalon is going after that person that wants a comfortable ride, they want a reliable vehicle, they want a roomy vehicle on the inside, they want that Camry Plus experience. If you want something that's a little bit sportier in that vein, there's the TRD. If you want to save fuel, then there's the hybrid version. That's a relatively similar shopper to what Kia is targeting with the Cadenza. With the K900, Lord only knows why they're selling that in the United States, to be honest. They sell only a few hundred. It's really more of a marketing play than anything else. The Chrysler 300 is for you if you want that classic rear-wheel drive American sedan. The Charger's the one for you if you want absolutely insane engines under the hood. And the Nissan Maxima is for you if you're looking for that Nissan Maxima feel. The Maxima does have a number of things going for it. Again, I like the way that it feels and drives out on the road, but it is certainly starting to feel old, and I would probably buy the Avalon before I bought the Maxima. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. What would you get if your money were on the line in this group of cars? I suspect I would probably get the Cadenza because the slightly softer suspension and the style fits me a little bit better, but I would also definitely look at the touring version of the Avalon. Be sure and find me over at facebook.com/AlexDonatos, Instagram, all those other social places, and check out our merch store over at aoamerch.com. I'll see all of you later.